The air in the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, always felt like a crisp, clean sheet against my skin. It was a sensation I'd come to crave, a stark contrast to the chaotic, decomposing world I spent my days reconstructing. My lab, specifically, was a sanctuary of polished steel and filtered light, each surface gleaming under the unwavering glare of overhead fluorescence. Here, amidst the hushed hum of ventilation and the faint, metallic tang of disinfectant, I, Chen, felt most at home. My specialization isn't for the faint of heart or the overly sentimental. I am a forensic anthropologist, a bone detective. I read stories written in calcium phosphate, narratives of violence, neglect, and sometimes ancient reverence. My fingers, usually clad in thin nitrile gloves, trace the subtle contours of a fractured femur, the telltale sign of a fall or a forceful blow. I analyze the wear patterns on teeth, the subtle shifts in bone density, piecing together a life, or more often, its brutal end from what remains. It's a meticulous, painstaking process and, frankly, one I preferred to conduct in the quiet solitude of my lab. Human interaction, I'd found, was rarely as straightforward as the skeletal remains of the deceased. My current project involved cataloging a collection of Bronze Age funerary urns, their contents long since reduced to ash and bone fragments. The delicate work of sifting through centuries-old dust, identifying even the smallest shard of cremated bone, was a meditative task. I was lost in the silent echoes of a long-dead civilization when my secure comm line buzzed. A direct line, reserved for official requests that couldn't wait for my usual measured response. My brow furrowed. Most of my work was academic, the occasional consultation for cold cases, but those were usually initiated through official channels, not a direct, urgent summons. I tapped the illuminated icon on my terminal. The face of a uniformed officer, stern and unfamiliar, flickered into view. His eyes, sharp and unwavering, met mine. "Dr. Chen." "Yes," I replied, my voice even. "This is Chen. We have a situation, Doctor, unconventional. The precinct chief himself requested my expertise. It's unusual." He paused as if searching for the right words. "We found a body, or what's left of one, in an abandoned industrial warehouse down by the old docks." The docks, a place that always carried a lingering scent of brine and decay even miles inland, an abandoned warehouse. Not exactly a pristine archaeological dig. "Unconventional how?" I asked, already feeling a prickle of unease. "The staging, Doctor, it's deliberate, almost ritualistic. The uniforms are out of their depth. The chief thinks I might be the only one who can make sense of it. He provided an address and a case number. We'll have a car waiting." The drive was a blur of flashing blue and red lights reflecting off the rain-slicked streets. The city, usually a cacophony of sounds and lights, felt hushed, expectant. The warehouse loomed ahead, a hulking silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Its corrugated metal walls were pockmarked and rusted, graffiti marring its surface like ancient scars. The air here was thick with the cloying smell of damp concrete and something else, something vaguely acrid. Uniformed personnel milled about the entrance, their faces grim. A uniformed detective, his expression etched with weariness, met me at the yellow tape. "Chen, thank I for coming. This way." He led me through a cavernous space, the air echoing with our footsteps. Dust motes danced in the beams of our flashlights. The scene itself was cordoned off in the center of the vast floor. Even from a distance, I could see it was unlike anything I'd encountered in my career. The victim, or what remained, was positioned with an unnerving precision. They lay supine, arms outstretched, palms facing upwards. And then there were the markings. Symbols etched into the concrete floor with what looked like chalk, encircling the victim. They were angular, intricate, and utterly alien to me. My mind immediately began sifting through comparative databases, ancient scripts, tribal symbols, occult iconography, but nothing surfaced. The detective gestured vaguely. "We haven't touched anything. Forensics are on their way, but the chief wanted I here first." The body was too far decomposed for immediate visual identification, but the posture, the arrangement of the stones, the symbols, it was all too deliberate. This wasn't a random act of violence. This was a performance, a statement. I leaned closer, my gaze sweeping over the chalk markings. They weren't just random scribbles. There was a pattern, a geometric precision that spoke of intent, not madness, and the stones. They weren't just any stones. I recognized their texture, their density from my own field work. Basalt, imported. This was more than just a peculiar murder. And the unsettling part, my gut, that infallible instinct honed by years of deciphering the silent language of bone, told me this was just the beginning. The first act in a play I didn't yet understand. The air in the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, bit at my exposed skin the moment I stepped through the automatic doors. It was a stark contrast to the humid, earthy scent that clung to me from the excavation site. I peeled off my outer layer of protective gear, the latex gloves cracking as I pulled them free. My colleagues moved with a hushed efficiency, their faces illuminated by the harsh overhead lights as they processed evidence from various cases. I nodded to a passing technician, my mind already racing ahead. Davies was waiting for me by the main examination table, his arms crossed, a familiar impatience radiating from him. He was a good investigator, sharp and by the book, but he lacked vision. He saw the pieces. I saw the whole, often terrifying picture. "Chen," he greeted, his voice clipped. "Glad you could make it. We've got the primary remains prepped for you." "Primary remains," I echoed, walking towards the gleaming stainless steel table. The body, or what was left of it, lay under a clear plastic drape. Even covered, the unnatural stillness was palpable. Davies gestured to the drape. "Go ahead." I pulled it back. The smell, faint but unmistakable, of decay mingled with something else. Something floral, almost perfumed. It was the scent of the grave, yes, but this was different. This was arranged. The body was positioned on its back, limbs splayed outwards in a way that felt less like a body collapsing and more like a deliberate pose. Around the skeletal remains, arranged with unnerving precision, were small, smooth stones, each one etched with a symbol I recognized instantly from my studies of ancient iconography. "Ritualistic," I stated, my voice low. It wasn't a question. Davies grunted. "That's what it looks like. The local boys are calling it the Stone Circle Killer. Charming, right?" He gestured to a tray of tools. "Standard procedure. We'll start with basic forensic analysis. DNA, trace evidence, cause of death." I ignored the tray. My gaze was fixed on the skeletal structure. The ribs were exposed, but not through simple decomposition. There were faint, almost microscopic striations along the bone, consistent with a very fine blade used with extreme care. "This wasn't about dismemberment for concealment," I murmured, tracing a line on the plastic drape where the sternum lay. "This was about presentation. The bones were cleaned meticulously, and look here." I pointed to a small indentation near the base of the skull. "There's a mark here, almost like a puncture, not deep enough to be fatal. Significant." Davies leaned in, his brow furrowed. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking this isn't just about the stones. The symbols," I said, my fingers itching to get closer, to touch the bone itself, to feel the story it held. "This is about the body, the way it's been prepared, the specific points of attention." He pulled out a small notebook. "So you think the killer is anatomically knowledgeable? More than knowledgeable, Davies. Reverent or perhaps possessive. They're treating the body like an artifact." I looked up at him, my eyes meeting his. "The stones, the symbols, they are a language, but the body is the text." A younger technician, a woman I'd seen around but never worked with directly, approached hesitantly. "Detective Davies, we've got preliminary toxicology results back for the victim. Nothing unusual. No drugs, no poisons." "See," Davies said, turning back to me, a hint of triumph in his voice. "Just a standard homicide, Chen. We just need to find the killer and their motive." "Motive is rarely standard," I countered, my gaze returning to the skeletal remains. The arrangement of the stones formed a specific pattern, a constellation, I realized with a jolt. a constellation I hadn't seen depicted in such a context for centuries. This isn't about a simple motive, Davies. This is about reclaiming something, or perhaps punishing something. I picked up a small, sterile brush from a nearby counter. I need to examine the skeletal remains directly, without the drape, and I need to see the surrounding soil samples from the discovery site. I suspect the stones aren't the only thing buried with the victim. Davies sighed, a sound of weary resignation. All right, Chen, your show. Just try to keep it to the science, not the ancient prophecies. A small smile touched my lips. The science is the ancient prophecies, Davies. We just have to learn to read them. As I began to carefully brush away the dust from the delicate bones, I felt it again, that prickle of unease, the sensation of being watched. It wasn't just the sterile environment of the forensic center. It was something deeper, a resonance with the victim, with the killer, with the very earth that had held this secret for so long. The stones were a clue, yes, but the body was the key, and I had a feeling that key would unlock far more than just a murder investigation. It would unlock a history I thought I had buried long ago. The air in the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, hummed with a low electronic thrum. It was the sound of progress, of science, of answers. But tonight it felt like a prelude to something else, something more primal. The prickle on my skin hadn't faded. I dismissed it as nerves, the lingering ghost of the first case, but it was back, a persistent whisper against my concentration. I leaned closer to the skeletal remains laid out on the gleaming stainless steel table. The preliminary report was already filed, the basic details logged. Male, mid-30s, cause of death consistent with blunt force trauma to the cranium. But the presentation, that was the anomaly. The way the femurs were crossed, the phalanges of the hands arranged in a precise fan shape. It wasn't random. It was deliberate. My colleague, a meticulous technician with perpetually ink-stained fingers, hovered nearby, his brow furrowed. "Anything new, Chen?" he asked, his voice a low murmur that barely disturbed the clinical quiet. I shook my head, my gaze fixed on the delicate curve of a clavicle. "Just details, the precision. It's too perfect to be accidental." I picked up a fine brush, its bristles softer than a sigh, and gently coaxed away a final veil of particulate matter from a rib. The bones were stark white against the sterile blue of the examination tray. Then the alert chimed, a sharp, insistent sound that cut through the hum. My colleague moved to the console, his fingers flying across the touchscreen. A live feed flickered to life on a wall-mounted monitor. A uniformed officer stood in what looked like a dimly lit warehouse, the air thick with what I could only imagine was the metallic tang of decay. "Second one." The officer's voice crackled through the speaker. "Same as the first. He was found an hour ago." My stomach tightened. I walked towards the monitor, my boots making soft, almost apologetic sounds on the polished floor. The image on the screen was grainy, but the details were horrifyingly clear. A body sprawled in a posture that sent a shiver down my spine. The limbs were arranged with that same unsettling symmetry. The hands splayed open, the legs crossed. "Location?" I asked, my voice tight. "Abandoned textile factory, East End docks," the officer replied. "Perimeter secured, we're waiting for your team." I looked at my colleague, his face was pale. "Two of them," he breathed. "And the same arrangement." This wasn't a coincidence. This was a signature, a message, and whoever was sending it was escalating. My academic detachment, the shield I'd carefully constructed around myself, was starting to crack. The drive to the factory was a blur of flashing blue lights and the jarring reality of the city at night. The warehouse loomed, a hulking silhouette against the bruised twilight sky. Yellow police tape, a garish barrier, cordoned off the entrance. Inside, the scene was a stark contrast to the pristine environment I'd left. Dust motes danced in the beams of our portable lights, illuminating cobwebs that hung like macabre decorations. The air was heavy, stagnant, smelling of damp concrete and something vaguely organic that I didn't want to identify. And there he was, the second victim. He lay in the center of a cleared space, the floor swept clean around him. His eyes, wide and unseeing, stared up at the cavernous ceiling. The positioning of his limbs was, if anything, even more deliberate than the first. His arms were outstretched, palms up, as if in supplication. His legs were crossed at the ankles, a subtle but distinct variation. I knelt beside him, my gloved hands hovering just above his skin. The ritualistic aspect was undeniable. This wasn't just murder, it was performance. I felt that familiar academic curiosity, the urge to dissect, to understand, warring with a rising tide of unease. Any personal effects? I inquired the uniformed officer standing guard, his face impassive. Nothing obvious, he replied. We're doing a sweep, but he was dressed in plain clothes. No wallet, no identification. I ran a gloved finger along the edge of his jawbone. The skin was cool, the rigor mortis setting in. But the stillness of death was amplified by the stillness of his pose. It felt ancient, male, late 20s. Cause of death, again, blunt force trauma. But as I meticulously examined the skeletal structure, a detail emerged that made my breath catch. The angle of the scapulae, the slight rotation of the pelvis, they were different from the first victim. Subtle, yes, but significant. It's not a perfect replication, I murmured, more to myself than anyone else. My colleague looked up from his microscope. What do you mean? The positioning, I explained, pointing to a diagram I was sketching. The first victim's arms were held closer to the torso. These are more outstretched, and the legs, the crossing is different. It's like a variation on a theme. A variation, not a copy. This wasn't a perpetrator following a rigid script. This was someone improvising, evolving. That night I couldn't sleep. The image of the second victim, his body arranged like a tableau, kept replaying in my mind. The ancient resonance I'd felt with the first victim was amplified. I found myself drawn to the digital archives of my university library, searching for information that had long been relegated to the dusty corners of my research. Burial customs, rituals, ancient peoples. I scrolled through images of excavated tombs, of mummified remains, of funerary art. There were similarities, of course. The practice of arranging the dead was universal. But as I delved deeper, sifting through academic papers on obscure Bronze Age rites and forgotten Siberian burial traditions, a pattern began to emerge. Certain symbolic arrangements of the limbs, specific gestures of the hands, they reappeared across disparate cultures, spanning millennia. One particular set of illustrations caught my eye, a collection of funerary effigies from a little-known Mesopotamian civilization. The poses were eerily familiar, the outstretched arms, the crossed legs. The accompanying text spoke of appeasement, of passage, of a cosmic balance. My heart began to thrum, not with fear, but with a dawning, terrifying understanding. This wasn't just about ancient rituals. This was about someone who knew them intimately, someone who was using them not as inspiration, but as a blueprint. And the escalation, the subtle variations, suggested a growing confidence, a deepening obsession. The killer was learning, adapting, and I was falling behind. The hum of the ventilation system in the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, was a constant, low thrum against my nerves. It was the soundtrack to my obsession. I'd been poring over the crime scene photos for hours, the harsh LED lights glinting off the glossy paper, each image a frozen tableau of meticulous horror. The second victim, the accountant, was the one that gnawed at me. His limbs positioned with an almost reverent precision, a bronze amulet clutched in his right hand. It wasn't just staged, it was performed. My fingers traced the outline of the amulet in the photograph. It was a small, intricately carved piece, depicting a coiled serpent swallowing its own tail. I'd seen it before, or something like it. The memory was a wisp, just out of reach. I pushed away from the workstation, the wheels of my chair squeaking a protest against the polished concrete floor. I needed to clear my head, to break the cycle of staring at the same evidence until it blurred into meaninglessness. I walked through the lab, the air thick with the sterile scent of disinfectants and something vaguely metallic. Colleagues, their faces grim and focused, moved with quiet efficiency. They were accustomed to death, but this was different. The deliberate artistry, the echo of something ancient, set these scenes apart from the usual tragedies that landed on our slab. My gaze fell on a display case showcasing artifacts from a recent archaeological dig. A flint arrowhead, a shard of pottery, a collection of bone beads. My heart gave a strange lurch. Among them, nestled on a velvet cushion, was a small, tarnished bronze pendant. It was almost identical to the one the accountant had been clutching. The serpent, its scales etched with painstaking detail, devouring its own tail. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the glass. The label beneath read, "Votive offering, late pre-Roman Iberian Peninsula." Iberian Peninsula. The word hung in the air, heavy with implication. This wasn't some random trinket. This was a specific artifact, tied to a particular time and place. I turned back to my workstation, my mind racing. The first victim, the historian, had been found with a circle of smooth river stones arranged around him, a gesture that had initially seemed arbitrary. Now it clicked. Such arrangements were common in ancient rituals meant to delineate sacred space to ward off malevolent spirits. And the second victim with the Iberian amulet, what was the connection? I pulled up the case files on my monitor, scrolling through the victimology reports. The historian, a specialist in ancient Mediterranean cultures. The accountant, a man whose only discernible public connection was a passion for collecting rare antiquities. It was too coincidental. The killer wasn't just mimicking rituals. They were targeting individuals with a connection, however tenuous, to these historical practices. I opened a new browser window, my fingers flying across the keyboard. Iberian cults, I typed. Then serpent symbolism ancient. Pages upon pages of academic journals and obscure historical forums flooded the screen. I clicked on one, then another, my eyes scanning for familiar motifs. And then I found it. A small digitized image from a scholarly article discussing the cult of Epona, a Celtic goddess whose worship spread throughout the Roman Empire, particularly in Gaul and Hispania. The article mentioned her association with fertility, horses, and a protective serpentine symbol. The Ouroboros, the serpent eating its tail, was a recurring image in their iconography, representing cyclical nature, eternal return, and rebirth. Rebirth. The word sent a shiver down my spine, not of cold this time, but of a dawning, dreadful understanding. The staged deaths, the deliberate placement of the bodies, the specific artifacts, it wasn't just about mirroring ancient rituals. It was about enacting them. The article also mentioned a specific, lesser-known sect that worshipped Epona through more esoteric rites, often involving secluded natural sites and symbolic offerings. Their practices were said to be shrouded in secrecy, passed down through generations. The author of the article, a doctor, Alastair Finch, was renowned for his work on fringe religious movements. I recognized the name. He was a contemporary of my father, a rival academic whose work I'd always found unsettling. I scrolled further, my gaze snagging on a footnote that mentioned Finch's personal research into a particular Iberian cult, one that allegedly practiced rituals of purification and ascension through symbolic death and rebirth. He'd claimed to have discovered a hidden sanctuary, a place of power, somewhere in the remote Pyrenees. The Pyrenees, a geographical link. My mind, a well-worn map of ancient trade routes and burial sites, immediately conjured images of rugged terrain, hidden valleys, and forgotten caves. This was no longer just a series of murders. It was a meticulously planned performance rooted in a specific, obscure historical tradition. And the killer wasn't just a madman, they were a devotee or perhaps a scholar. I leaned back, the sterile environment of the forensic center suddenly feeling suffocating. The Ouroboros, the serpent eating its tail, a symbol of endless cycles. They was the killer trapped in one. Or were they trying to break free? The historian, the accountant, the carefully chosen artifacts, the historical cult. It was all coming together, a macabre mosaic, and I was just starting to see the full, terrifying picture. My father's old research notes, tucked away in my attic, suddenly felt like a ticking clock. He'd been obsessed with similar fringe groups. Had he known about this cult? Had he known about Finch? The fluorescent lights of the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, hummed a relentless, high-pitched song that vibrated in my teeth. It was a familiar discomfort, the constant sonic reminder of my detachment from the living world. I'd been staring at the enlarged photographs of the latest victim for what felt like an eternity. The meticulous arrangement of the grave goods, a scattering of polished river stones, a single, intricately carved bone amulet was unnerving in its precision. It wasn't just ritualistic, it was personal. My fingers traced the outline of the amulet in the photo. It was identical to one I'd seen before, not in any archaeological text, but in a dusty box in my childhood home. My breath hitched. This was no coincidence. My gaze flickered to the other images, the precise positioning of the cadaver, the subtle dusting of ochre pigment on the cheekbones. It was a tableau, a deliberate message, but to whom and why? A shadow fell across my workspace. I didn't jump, not outwardly. Years spent sifting through the remnants of lives long extinguished had taught me a certain stillness. I simply looked up, my eyes meeting those of the lead detective. He was a man of few words, his face etched with a weariness that seemed to seep from the very walls of the facility. Anything, Chen. His voice was a low rumble cutting through the hum. I pushed a strand of hair behind my ear, the motion deliberate. There's a pattern. Not just in the rituals, but in the details. The amulet, for instance, it's specific, and I think I've seen it before. He leaned closer, his gaze falling on the photograph. Where? My mind raced, sifting through fragmented memories, the kind I usually kept locked away. Childhood summers, the scent of pine needles, the rough texture of my grandmother's hands. It's from my family, an heirloom, I think. My grandmother had one just like it. A flicker of something unreadable crossed the detective's face. He straightened, his posture stiffening. My family, are I sure? As sure as I can be without seeing the original. The thought sent a shiver down my spine, a sensation entirely alien to this climate-controlled environment. This wasn't just about ancient history anymore. This was about me. He was silent for a moment, the hum of the ventilation system suddenly seeming louder, more oppressive. We found something else at the scene, tucked beneath the victim's shroud. He reached into a manila envelope and withdrew a small, folded piece of parchment. It was old, brittle, and covered in what looked like dried mud. He carefully unfolded it. On it, drawn in what I immediately recognized as the same ochre pigment used on the victim, was a symbol. It was crude, yet disturbingly familiar. It was a stylized raven, its wings outstretched. This was not a metaphor, specializing in obscure folklore, specifically regional death cults from the early medieval period. The detective's eyes narrowed. And this amulet, I rest saying the killer might have known about it, known I'd recognize it. Or, I countered, my mind working furiously, piecing together the horrifying implications. They wanted me to. They're not just replicating rituals, they are engaging with me through the victim. He looked at me, a new urgency in his gaze. This isn't just about a killer with a penchant for the past, Chen. This is personal. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The meticulous staging, the specific amulet, the raven symbol, it was all a breadcrumb trail leading directly to me. This wasn't an abstract academic puzzle anymore. It was a threat. They know who I am, I said, the words tasting like ash. They know about my family. They're not just leaving clues, they're leaving warnings. He nodded, his jaw tight. And they are escalating. The last victim was found only 12 hours after the previous one. This isn't a spree, it's a campaign. He looked around the sterile, impersonal room, then back at me. And I am now the primary target. The hum of the machinery seemed to amplify, buzzing directly into my skull. I felt a sudden, overwhelming claustrophobia, a desperate urge to escape the polished surfaces and controlled air. The carefully constructed walls of my isolation, built brick by painstaking brick over years, were crumbling. The hum of the machinery seemed to amplify, buzzing directly into my skull. Davies, a perpetually rumpled man whose brilliance was often obscured by his cynicism, watched me from across the gleaming dissection table. His arms were crossed, his brow furrowed, a silent question hanging in the sterile air of the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold. "You all right there, Chen?" he questioned, his voice a low rumble that did little to cut through the oppressive silence. I took a deep, shaky breath, forcing my gaze away from the intricate patterns of bone laid out beneath the harsh lights. "Just a bit much," I managed, my voice thinner than I'd intended. The victim, the third in this ghastly procession, lay before us, his arrangement a chilling echo of the previous two. The precise positioning, the symbolic placement of artifacts, it wasn't the work of a lone madman, not anymore. The uniformity spoke of something far more deliberate. "A bit much." Davies scoffed softly, pushing off the table. He walked over to a bank of monitors displaying cross-sections of tissue and skeletal structures. "This is our job, Chen. We dissect, we analyze, we find out what happened." He gestured to the body. "And what happened here is meticulous, too meticulous for a spontaneous act." I nodded, my eyes scanning the victim's carefully positioned hands. One was fisted, the other open, palm up. A small, intricately carved stone bird rested in the open palm. I'd seen the same bird, or one identical, with the first victim. The second had a different object, a coiled serpent, but the style, the material, was the same. "It's the symbols," I answered, my voice gaining a little strength. "The consistent iconography. These aren't random, they're meant to convey something." I pointed to the bird. This specific species, the way it's depicted, it's linked to ancient fertility rites in a very obscure Anatolian cult. The second victim had the serpent, a symbol of rebirth often associated with the same pantheon. And the third, I trailed off, looking at the stone bird again. "It's the same. They're not just offering sacrifices, they're telling a story." Davies leaned closer, his usual detachment momentarily replaced by a flicker of professional curiosity. "Anatolian cults, you're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a direct textual reference," I replied. "The stylization, the specific features of the carving, it's a match for artifacts I studied years ago before I retreated." The word hung in the air, a ghost of my past. He was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the monitor. "So, we have a killer with an encyclopedic knowledge of ancient symbology and a penchant for theatrical displays. Still sounds like a lone wolf to me, albeit a very educated one. But the resources, Davies," I countered, walking over to him. "The preservation of the bodies, the almost surgical precision of the incisions to place these artifacts without disturbing surrounding tissue. This isn't something you do in a backyard shed. And the staging. Look at the arrangement of the limbs. It's not just symbolic, it's meant to be visually arresting, almost like an altar." I pulled up a digital image on a nearby screen, a photograph of the first victim. The way the body was positioned, the slight elevation of the pelvis, the angle of the arms, it mirrored depictions of a specific ritualistic burial I'd seen in an ancient text. "This pose," I explained, tracing the outline with my finger. "It's meant to facilitate a spiritual ascent. It's a very specific, very learned practice." Davies whistled softly. "Okay, I'll grant you the expertise, but a group? What would be the motive for a group to do this? It's not robbery, it's not passion, it's art in a twisted way." "Or propaganda," I murmured, my mind racing. "What if these aren't just killings? I dismiss them then as the ramblings of eccentrics. And if it's a belief system, it's likely organized, likely funded." I looked back at the body, at the careful, deliberate placement of the stone bird. And if it's organized, it's dangerous, not just to the victims, but to anyone who gets in their way. Davies was silent, his eyes scanning the data, the images, the spectral X-rays. The usual cynicism seemed to be slowly eroding, replaced by a grudging acknowledgement. "The preservation is the key, isn't it? That level of preservation requires specialized equipment, a controlled environment, not something you can easily replicate without significant investment." He tapped a finger on a monitor displaying a high-resolution scan of the victim's musculature. And the clean incisions. It suggests familiarity with anatomy, also with sterile surgical techniques. Exactly, I responded, feeling a surge of adrenaline, a dangerous clarity. This isn't random violence. This is a ritual performed by highly skilled individuals, operating with a shared ideology. The question isn't just who is doing this, but why are they doing it and who is backing them. My gaze drifted to the ceiling, to the sterile white tiles that seemed to stretch into infinity. And I, Chen, was no longer a detached observer. I was on it, and the play was just beginning. The walls of my isolation hadn't just crumbled, they'd been deliberately torn down. The hum of the ventilation system in the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, was usually a comforting white noise, a testament to the controlled environment where I wrestled with the dead. Tonight, it felt like a gnawing insect, a persistent irritant in the silence that pressed in. Davy stood across from me, his usual gruff demeanor softened by a flicker of unease in his eyes. He held a thin file, its edges worn from repeated handling. "The lab results are back on the latest find," he added, his voice low. "The artifacts. They're not replicas, Chen, not entirely." I leaned forward, my gaze fixed on the file, a knot tightening in my stomach. I'd spent the last 48 hours poring over the fragments recovered from the abandoned factory, the ones that had been carefully placed around the victim's body like offerings. Intricate carvings, bone shards polished to a disturbing sheen, and what looked like dried, brittle plant matter. My initial assessment had been that they were part of a sophisticated forgery, designed to mimic the ritualistic elements we'd seen in the previous cases. But Davy's words, they chipped away at that certainty. "What do you mean, not entirely?" I wondered, trying to keep my voice even. He opened the file, sliding a glossy photograph across the polished steel table. It showed a close-up of a small, intricately carved bone fragment. The detail was exquisite, depicting a coiled serpent. Underneath, a series of microscopic images showed trace elements. "The carbon dating is problematic," Davies continued, his brow furrowed. "It puts the age of the bone itself somewhere in the late Bronze Age. But the organic material, the resin used to bind some of the fragments together, and the microscopic traces of pigment, they're much, much younger, contemporary in fact." My mind raced. Bronze Age bone, modern resin. It was a contradiction, a deliberate juxtaposition that screamed more than just a macabre hobby. This wasn't about replicating ancient rituals, it was about usurping them, infusing the past with the present, a twisted kind of resurrection. "So, it's a composite," I murmured, my fingers tracing the serpent on the photograph. "The killer is taking genuine ancient artifacts and modifying them. Or they're creating new ones that are indistinguishable from the old, using ancient materials where possible," Davies corrected, his gaze sharp. "The lab is still trying to pinpoint the exact origin of the bone, but the sheer skill involved in the carving, the precision. This was more than just a killer with a penchant for ancient rites. They all had some connection, however tenuous, to historical preservation. The curator at the museum, the archaeologist who consulted on the new development project, and now the archivist from the city planning department." Davies nodded slowly. "We've been digging into their recent activities, anything that might have put them in the crosshairs of someone obsessed with, well, with whatever this is." He paused, then added, "The archivist, the last victim, he'd recently flagged a discrepancy in the land deeds for the new downtown development, something about a protected historical site that was supposedly delisted decades ago." Protected historical site, delisted. The words echoed in the sterile expanse of the forensic center. I pictured the sprawling blueprints I'd seen at the city planning office, the ambitious skyscrapers slated to rise. Beneath them, what lay buried? What forgotten history was being systematically erased, or perhaps resurrected in the most horrifying way? The killer isn't just staging murders. I realized, the pieces clicking into place with a sickening certainty. They're covering something up, something buried literally and figuratively. My thoughts immediately went to the peculiar alignment of the bodies, the specific gestures I'd noted in my forensic reports, mirroring ancient burial practices meant to appease or contain something. And the artifacts, I continued, my voice gaining a desperate edge. They're not just props. They're part of the ritual, a way to legitimize the erasure, to make it seem like history itself is endorsing the crime. Davies met my gaze, his expression grim. We've got a potential lead. The archivist's last communication was with a private historical consultant named Elias Thorne. He's been involved in a lot of the delisting processes for historical sites over the years, and he's got a reputation for being thorough. Thorne. The name sent a jolt through me, a faint, almost imperceptible tremor of recognition. I'd seen his name on academic papers, his theories often bordering on the fringe, yet compelling. He was a ghost in the academic world, rarely seen. His influence was undeniable. Where is he now? I inquired, my heart beginning to beat a little faster, not with fear, with a fierce, burning resolve. He has an office in the old warehouse district, Davies answered, pushing another photograph across the table. This one showed a man with sharp features, piercing eyes, and a smile that didn't quite reach them. Elias Thorne. We're mobilizing a team, but I thought you should be the one to see him first, given your expertise. The warehouse district, it was a place where history, the forgotten kind, festered. I'll go, I responded, my voice firm, but I'm not going alone. Davies gave a curt nod. Understood. As I stood, the sterile air of the lab seemed to press in on me. No longer a sanctuary, but a cage. The artifacts, the victims, the unearthed secrets, they were all leading to this. My own past, with its own buried traumas, felt like a heavy cloak I couldn't shed. But for the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of something akin to purpose. The killer was staging rituals, but I was about to perform my own. A ritual of exposure. The hum of the ventilation system in the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, usually soothed me. Tonight it was a grating buzz, a soundtrack to the knot tightening in my gut. I traced the faint outline of a symbol on the digital display of the mass spectrometer, a symbol I'd seen etched into bone, whispered in forgotten texts, and now scrawled on the wall of the abandoned warehouse where they'd found the latest victim. It was the final piece, the Rosetta Stone of this whole nightmare. A colleague, his face pale under the harsh fluorescent lights, entered the lab. He held a thin file, his movements hesitant. Chen, they're ready for you. I nodded, my gaze still fixed on the screen, the symbol. It wasn't just a mark of ritual, it was a brand, a mark of ownership. And the victims, each one meticulously posed, each with that brand, were not just sacrifices. They were statements, warnings. I remembered the first time I saw it, on the femur of a skeleton unearthed from a peat bog centuries old. I dismissed it then, a curious anomaly. Now it was a neon sign flashing danger. This wasn't about ancient rites. It was about a modern cult, a shadowy organization that had twisted history to serve their own twisted agenda. The drive to the precinct felt longer than usual. My mind replayed the interviews, the fragmented clues, the faces of the families who had lost loved ones. Inside the interrogation room, the air was thick with a tension that had nothing to do with the faulty air conditioning. The stranger sat across from me, his hands clasped calmly on the table. He was the one who had orchestrated it all, the architect of this macabre performance. I'd pieced together his motives, his reach, the way he'd manipulated history for his own gain. He'd seen himself as a modern-day high priest, carrying out a sacred duty. You understand now, don't you? The stranger's voice was smooth, almost conversational, a stark contrast to the horror he'd inflicted. The cleansing, the renewal, the old ways must be honored even in this modern age. I leaned forward, my voice low but steady. You didn't honor anything, you desecrated. You used ancient symbols, ancient beliefs to mask your own greed, your own lust for power. I gestured to a photograph on the table, a crime scene photo of the latest victim, the familiar symbol stark against pale skin. This isn't about tradition, it's about control, and you picked the wrong person to try and control. He chuckled, a dry, rasping sound. "You with your dusty bones and your quiet life. What could you possibly know of the forces at play?" "I know enough," I countered, my gaze unwavering. "I know about the illicit antiquities trade, the way you've been funneling funds through shell corporations using these rituals as a smokescreen. I know about the senator who's been feeding you information, the one who benefits most from the instability you create." The senator, a man whose public image was built on integrity, a man I'd once admired. The betrayal was a bitter pill to swallow. The stranger's smile faltered. A flicker of something surprise, anger, crossed his face. He'd underestimated me just as everyone else had. He'd seen me as a detached academic buried in the past. He hadn't seen the survivor, the one who had learned to excavate trauma, to piece together fragmented lives, both living and dead. "The senator will be dealt with," I added, my voice hardening. "And so will you." The confession, when it came, was a torrent. He spoke of his disillusionment, his belief that society had lost its way, its connection to something primal. He spoke of the thrill of the hunt, the artistic satisfaction he derived from each meticulously staged scene. He even confessed to the small, unsettling details, the way he'd carefully arranged the victim's limbs, the specific flowers he'd placed at their feet, all mirroring ancient funerary practices he'd studied. He was a storyteller, he believed, but his narrative was one of death and destruction. As the law enforcement officers led him away, the weight in my chest began to lift. The conspiracy was unraveling, the threads pulled taut, finally revealing the ugly truth beneath. The senator was already being brought in, his carefully constructed facade crumbling under the evidence I'd helped uncover. Back in the state-of-the-art forensic center, everything sterile and cold, the silence was profound. The artifacts, once symbols of a horrifying mystery, now felt like remnants of a battle fought and won. I looked at my hands, the same hands that had sifted through dirt and bone, that had pieced together lives long gone. They were steady now. My own past, the buried traumas I'd always kept at a distance, felt different. They weren't chains anymore, but scars, proof of survival. The academic isolation, the retreat into the quiet world of the dead, had been a form of protection. The resolution wasn't just about bringing a killer to justice. It was about finding my own peace, about integrating the fragmented pieces of myself. The hum of the ventilation system was just a hum again, a gentle reminder of the steady, predictable rhythm of life, a rhythm I was finally ready to rejoin.